Good morning, everybody. My name is Rob Dietl. I'm the off-board chair of the Internal Communications Committee at UNICON and Director of Executive Programs at MIT Sloan. Delighted that you can join us today for a very timely and informative webinar. Today we're going to be covering the recently released research report, Understanding the Financial Times Executive Education Rankings, a 360-degree review. We will have a follow-up. This is really part one of a series of webinars to address this research project and to share some information and engage with you to take your questions and hopefully have a good dialogue on this topic. I'd just like to take a minute to remind you that this webinar is being recorded and will be eventually reposted to the UNICON website for your review. I also want to point out that we do have a handout associated with this presentation today, and you'll see that in your menu for the GoToMeeting toolbar as a handout. It's listed as the infographic on how the FTEE rankings work. So you should be able to access that as a PDF and download that and print off a copy if you'd like for reference. We do have a very good turnout for today's webinar, so we are hoping to have a very engaging dialogue. There will be time for questions and answers at the end of the presentation, but we also encourage you to use your chat box. If there's a pressing question that you have, please use your chat box and list the question there, and we'll be able to bring that to the attention of our presenter today. With that in mind, I don't really want to take much more time. I would like to get into the content for today's program. So it's my pleasure to introduce to you Tom Cavers. Tom is a market research and strategy consultant who's worked extensively in education, including in-depth market surveys into online learning, open enrollment programs, custom programs, executive coaching, as well as executive search and assessments. As a classically trained marketer who works with academia, Tom focuses on driving impact by translating research findings into clear and tangible action. Tom is a partner with Green Flash Consulting, a boutique market research and strategy firm. Prior to joining Green Flash, Tom held marketing leadership roles with Clorox, Del Monte, and Safeway. He holds an MBA from UC Berkeley and graduated from Occidental College with distinction in philosophy. The first few slides are really just meant to guide you through operating the GoToMeeting platform that we're using today. So as you'll see on this first slide, you can use the orange arrow at the top left to control your webinar. And then Tom, if you could just advance the slide. Just a follow-up in terms of what you can expect to see with an open window on the presenter's computer. You should be able to hear and see real-time. We will not be using a camera for today's session unless Tom chooses to turn it on at different points in time. We'll be focusing on this PowerPoint presentation that you should be seeing right now. As I mentioned, if you do have any questions during the presentation, please label it or enter it into the chat box, and I'll be monitoring that as well. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Tom, just again to thank you for your participation in today's webinar. Tom, over to you.
Thank you, Ron, for that very nice introduction. No, I won't be using the camera today, and just that's for a practical reason. I don't want us to run into any bandwidth issues, especially with about 45 attendees on the call. So hopefully you all can hear me well and you can see the presentation. I have the title screen up now. And as Rob mentioned, as we go along, he will, please type in any questions you have into the chat box. He will interrupt me if he feels there's a question that we want to stop the presentation for. Otherwise, we're going to make sure we have some time, if I keep up a good pace here. We'll make sure we have some time at the end of the presentation to ask questions as well. So with that, let me kind of jump into things here. And I want to say first up front, if you've never worked on the rankings or have very little knowledge of them, I hope this presentation will really educate you about how those rankings work, and that's the real focus here. If you have some knowledge of the rankings, but it's not very deep, I hope we can deepen it and actually give you a really detailed look into the rankings today. And I do expect that some of you actually have a lot of knowledge about the rankings. And, you know, I don't know if we'll have anything new for you here today. We might, but we might not. But regardless, what I do hope you get out of this is at least a good capstone report and potentially a useful tool for you to use with your other stakeholders within your institution or even without, to explain to them how the rankings do work. And those materials could be this presentation or webinar itself, but also the infographic that we've created around this. And I know actually the Financial Times has told us that they love the infographic. So hopefully this is all giving you guys some helpful tools that you can use to explain the rankings to people. So with that, the agenda we're going to go through will give you a little bit of background on the report we conducted today, talk a little bit about the Financial Times Exec Ed rankings and how they came to be, and then we'll jump right into how the rankings work and really get into the nitty-gritty. And then we'll do a Q&A. Again, though, if you want to stop me for any pertinent questions as we go along, let Rob know. And then I'm going to give you a little sneak peek of our next webinar, which is a sort of a 360 view of the rankings, and that's going to come in about 2 weeks, October 15th. All right, so with that, I'm going to go into the background. And just before I do that, though, I have a few preparatory remarks. UNICON sponsored this report. However, what you will see is that the viewpoints and materials represented here are those of the authors only. That's myself, as well as Jenny Stein, and Jim Polcrano, who will be giving the next webinar, and I'm sure some of you have know them and know them well. The other thing is that just prior to completing this research, as many of you may know, Pearson sold the FT to Nikkei, and that was quite a bit of news. To be honest with you, we really don't know how that's going to affect these rankings, but it is a big piece of news and interesting. And then another interesting thing happened as we were working on the report, and that is in early 2015, Poets and Quants reported that Business Week decided to drop its executive ed as well as its EMBA rankings, which makes the Financial Times the only active executive education ranking today, which certainly raises its prominence and the importance of it to the industry. So UNICON asked us to do this report. And at a high level, the big question was, hey, if we were to do a 360-degree view of the rankings, what would we learn? We looked at it from every angle. What would we learn? But there were really 5 key questions under that. The first was, how do the rankings really work? There's actually a fair amount of confusion out there, and we heard that from the FT, actually. And that's what we're going to deal with today. Questions 2 through 5, what do the rankings say about the quality of programs? Do customers use them, and if so, how? How do business schools perceive the rankings? And what do experts who work in rankings or study executive education, what do they have to say about rankings? Topics 2 through 5 will be covered in this October 15 webinar, and I'll give you a little sneak peek of that at the end here. Today we're going to deal with how the rankings really work. Our research methodology fell into 3 main buckets. We did some surveys and interviews of the market. So we surveyed open enrollment participants as well as customers, learning and development professionals. We did quite a bit. Our survey is 700 different open participants and 279 learning and development professionals were surveyed. We also interviewed them very in depth. We did interviews and surveys with schools. So we surveyed, I think it was one of the highest response rates from UNICON member schools. 86 schools from UNICON responded and 8 from Exed, 94 total schools. And then we also spoke to 14 experts in the field of rankings. And then finally we did some secondary research into the methodology and the history. We did a lot of analysis, really digging into correlations for the ranking for MBAs and swings in ranking data and all that stuff, and I can talk to you about that at the end of this report. And then we did some research into the academic literature. Importantly, I do want to highlight here that we spoke multiple times with the FT, in putting together this report, and particularly in putting together this report that we're giving you today on how the rankings work. And the FT was very helpful, and as I mentioned, I think they really validated our interpretation of how the rankings work, and told us that the infographics great and answered all of our numerous questions on the topic. So with that, let's talk a little bit about our subject here, the FT. How did it start? It started in 1999, and it came out at the same time that the FT launched its other MBA rankings. And it's interesting, the genesis of the whole thing was really had to do with business schools in Europe wanting to make sure that they had a ranking that had an international focus. And Della Bradshaw, who oversees the rankings and is the editor of them at the FT, is very clear about this and has spoken about it. You know, they started them, she says, we started producing them because we were under pressure from some of the big business schools in Europe to produce rankings. There were all kinds of rankings coming out in the 90s in the US as well as Europe, but many in the US. And so, as she said it, we were under pressure because they wanted to see a proper international ranking. So it started with a very international focus, and you'll see that in a lot of the detail coming here today. And it's grown into a really key indicator for the executive education industry. Started out with 30 schools. Now there are over 100 schools that participate. I think it was 102 that participated in this last round. And the ranking is now 75 open schools and 85 custom. There's also good representation of schools worldwide, 30 plus in the EU, 20 plus in North America, 10 in Latin America, and 10 plus in Latin America, and 7 plus in Asia. And a number of new schools, as many of you probably know, came on from Asia this year. And it's the only executive ed ranking by a major business publication out there today. It's also something that you see widely used by schools, and this is something that you can see in these examples we're giving here. You know, it's a way to validate the quality of what the school is offering, and is used in all kinds of marketing materials, and these are just a few examples that we pulled from the web. Randomly, by the way. So I don't know if anyone from these schools are on the line, but it was just random. And the truth is there's some confusion out there about how these rankings work, and that's partly the genesis of this report. And we spoke to the FT about this, and it was interesting what they said. You know, they said, we spend 1 day a week on average responding to issues and requests and meeting with business schools to explain the rankings. And, you know, they said it still seems that many schools do not understand the rankings, even with, as they see it, their efforts to be transparent. So we're hoping to help fill that gap and answer the question of how the rankings really work, and go that extra step of really getting into the details here to help you understand how they work. What I will say, though, and this is my next slide, is that it's actually a hard thing to piece together, and that there's going to be a limit to the questions we can answer for a few reasons. One is that they don't share their formulas or their raw data. You know, a school itself, if it calls up the FT, can get the raw data and get its own results, but they can't get the actual formulas behind how it's calculated. And we can't share with you the actual questions or instruments that are used, though we do know some about them, the type of scale they use, and you know, I'm sure some of you have participated in them, I suspect, and have seen how they work, but that's not a public piece of information. And then we don't have details about the actual programs or the actual clients that are measured in the rankings. And so, you know, there's some big pieces of the puzzle here that are actually missing, and that we're not going to be able to address today. So I just, you know, want to get that on the table, but hopefully we can help move it forward and help answer at least a lot of your questions. So how does the magic happen? How does this ranking work? All right, so this is going to get kind of technical, but we're going to go through and methodically, hopefully, explain how these things work. The first thing is that eligible schools choose to participate. I want to highlight first that comment, choose to participate. The FT does not go out and recruit schools to participate. They maintain a list of schools that have an intention to participate or have participated in the past and send out notices to these schools, but they made a point to us that they're not recruiting schools to participate necessarily. Eligibility really falls, there are two main requirements. First, that you have international accreditation with EQUIS or AACB. 5 years ago, AMBA was part of this accreditation. It is no longer part of the accreditation requirement. They stopped that 5 years ago. And then the second thing is that you have $2 million in revenue, US dollars, in revenue for either open or your custom programs, whichever one you're going to be ranking in for the preceding year that you were ranked. Now, there's two important caveats to both of these requirements. The first, regarding accreditation, is that FT may waive this if the organization can prove it offers services that directly compete with business schools and executive education. An example of this is the Center for Creative Leadership, or maybe Duke CE, where these are not business school organizations necessarily, although Duke's obviously affiliated, but are separate organizations that are not necessarily EQUIS or AACB accredited, but clearly offer services that fall into the bucket of executive education. And then the caveat with regard to the revenue requirement is that it's based upon currency exchange rates for the year in which the revenue is being measured. It is not based upon a parity adjustment, a PPP adjustment, and that's something that's sort of an interesting difference with the executive education ranking and actually the MBA rankings, where they do adjust salaries based upon PPP. So getting a little technical there, but there are some interesting caveats to the eligibility requirements. I'm going to jump on to the open programs and how open works. So once you're eligible, you nominate your programs, and if you're looking to nominate open programs, you can nominate between 2 and 4 of your programs. At least one that's a general management program targeted at mid-level participants and has a 3-day minimum duration, and up to 2, and at least 1 and up to 2 advanced management programs that are targeted at senior level participants and is 5 days minimum. These programs, it's important, they have to be general, like an AMP type program, and not a functional, not a marketing or an innovation program, but a general program. And you need to provide emails for all of the participants who attended in the past year for that program. Then what the FT does is it's going to survey your participants. And that's going to end, that survey is going to become 80% of the overall weighting for the ranking. They require a minimum of 50 responses in the survey and a response rate of 20%. And interestingly, they'll ask you, they have questions behind these 10 categories here. They have questions behind each category, generally about 3 questions per category. But they also ask, and this is an interesting part of the survey, they also ask the participants to determine the weighting for each of these categories, not the individual questions, but each of these categories. And so they allow participants to rate the importance of the criteria on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 equaling poor and 10 equaling excellent. So that's a neat feature of it, in the sense that 1 year course design might be more important than faculty. You know, participants can determine whether that is. But we don't know all the questions that go into what determines course design, what determines preparation, etc. So after they do the surveys, they also ask the schools, this is the next slide, they also ask the schools to provide key metrics, and this represents 20% of the overall ranking. The weightings for these metrics are determined by FT, and they do not change year in, year out. For open, there's 6 different metrics: repeat business and growth, faculty diversity, female participants, partner schools, international participants, and international location. And you can really see here some of the international importance and international criteria showing themselves. And you'll see that in the custom ranking as well. And like I said, this will eventually end up being 20% of the overall ranking. So for custom, let me turn to custom now. Custom is very similar, but actually a little more complicated. That's why I did open first. So with custom, like with open, schools nominate the programs and then provide the corporate clients for the FT, corporate client emails for the FT to reach out to them. But a couple important things, these are not the participants of the program that are surveyed, it's actually the corporate client, so the learning and development or human resource professional who's in charge of implementing this program. And a minimum of 20 of these clients overall need to be submitted, 5 responding. As an interesting side note, you know, the FT has tried, I believe on at least 2 occasions, to survey participants of custom programs, but they told us that the response rate was too low to use the data. So that's been a little bit of an obstacle to getting participants surveyed in this. Now, the custom survey gets a little more complicated here than the open one. This is our next slide here, with some additional weightings that the FT applies. So clients are asked for these additional weightings to characterize the types of programs they have. And there's 4 different characterizations here. Is the program strategic, general, or functional? It gets more weighting if it's strategic. What's the seniority of the individual sponsoring the course? If it's the CEO, it gets more weighting than if it's the VP. What's the size of the client organization? Bigger organizations get more weighting. And how many, and this is a really interesting one and somewhat controversial, how many schools has the client commissioned customized courses with in the last 3 years? The more schools, the more weight to the custom program. And that's an interesting one because some schools have a very specific strategy of going very deep with their customers to provide all of their learning and development exec ed needs, and so those customers would get less weighting than a customer who's hired multiple schools to do that. So these additional weightings are interesting and complicated, and then these weightings are applied to the survey that is a lot like the open survey, but again, it has these weightings applied to it. So there's 10 criteria for the open survey, and only 2 of them are different than the, 10 criteria for the custom survey, and only 2 of them are different than for the open survey, and that is future use and value for money. Those take the place of food and accommodation and quality of participants. Other than that, it's a very similar survey. And then also like open, custom schools provide key metrics. These are international clients, faculty diversity, overseas programs, partner schools, and international participants. And so once again, you're seeing here the international focus of this ranking bearing out in terms of the metrics and the metrics that are measured. Okay, so we've surveyed the schools, we've gotten their key metrics. How do we then calculate this ranking? And this is going to get into some statistics, and I hope none of you ask me any questions about statistics later on, because I took statistics a long time ago at Berkeley. But I have some understanding of it, and if you really have a question, I'll be glad to answer it. So the FT manages all the surveys and all the data gathering, but they work with an outside consultant to actually calculate the ranking. And there's 4 key steps to calculating this ranking. The first step is to convert the answers for each criteria into a z-score. That's a statistic that standardizes the scores and shows where they rely in relation to the average. So assumes a normal distribution and standardizes it so you can compare different scores across different distributions. After you convert it into a z-score, then you apply the weightings that were all mentioned previously. And custom has a lot of weightings applied to it, as you know. Then the FT uses 3 years of previous data to smooth out any year-by-year swings. And some of you may have noticed that there can be pretty big swings in these rankings, and I think the FT's trying to address that with this 3 years of smoothing of data. I'm not sure it always works, but they're definitely using that to address it. And the way they do that, I'm going to jump to another slide here, bear with me here. The way they smooth it is for 3 years, the first year gets 40%, second year gets 33%, and the third year gets 27%. So the latest year gets the greatest weight. If a school's only been in the ranking for 2 years, then the weighting is 55-45 for the first year and the second year. Then the last thing they do, this last bucket here, is that they rank the weighted z-scores. They put all the z-scores in a table and they rank them. But only the ranking number is what's made public. As you know, the ranking doesn't show the actual z-scores. So if you see, and you may have seen this sometimes in the rankings, if you see 2 schools that are ranked the same, if they both come in at 7, then they have the same z-score. There's no statistical difference between them, and they have the same z-score, and that's why they show up as ranked the same. And actually, in this latest ranking, there were a couple instances where that occurred. So it is an important part of how the ranking works. Okay, so finally they've done the surveys, and now they've calculated the ranking, and now they publish the ranking. The total number of schools that are included in the rankings changes each year. It's been growing steadily over the years. There's 75 now for open, 85 for custom, and 50 overall. The number included, and we talked to the FT about this quite a bit, the number included in each ranking is based upon the number of eligible schools that choose to participate, and then also have a sufficient response rate from their surveys. You know, I think there might be some schools that that meet the criteria and don't end up in this total here, because FT may be choosing a number that's the FT may be choosing a number that's a multiple of 5, and some schools may fall short of that. We don't know the answer to that, but it would seem like it could be the case. Ultimately, what it comes down to is whether or not, you know, they're saying that whether or not schools are eligible and whether or not their response rate is great. But there is some question here about the total number that's chosen. Finally, the timeline of how this all works. So in December, FT sends out notices to schools advising them that the ranking is going to be taking place and telling them all the logistics of how to participate in it. In February, the surveys actually go out to the clients. In March, all the data needs to be collected and provided, both the surveys and the key metrics. And by May, all the rankings are published. And I think that is it. So, stop right there for any Q&A.
That's great. Thank you, Tom. So at this point, we'll open up the lines, and if anybody does have questions for Tom, please feel free to go ahead and ask. And Tom, while we're waiting for some of the questions to surface, I actually have a couple. Thank you very much for an excellent presentation and clearly explaining a lot of the research and the process that went into this project. Something that's in my mind in terms of with Business Week dropping its biannual report, is there any sense that other media publications or channels may enter this space to provide some competition to the FT?
That's a good question, Rob. And haven't seen anything yet in that respect. You get the sense that conducting a survey and putting together an actual ranking is not necessarily an easy thing to do, and it's not necessarily the only way that you can participate in creating news and publishing around executive education. And in fact, I had an interesting conversation with someone about Business Week, where they were speculating about Business Week and what might have been the reason for their stopping their ranking. And the thought was that, you know, rankings are one way to generate news, but there's other ways you can generate news and sell advertising besides rankings. You know, you can write stories, you can do in-depth reports. So, you know, I'm not necessarily sure that anyone's going to jump into this space just yet, especially if they're not already involved with MBA rankings.
Yeah.
And already have kind of the process and infrastructure in place for it. But I do think, you know, I keep my eye peeled. Certainly great.
And we do have a question from the audience. What happens if you were not rated for custom for a year? What happens the following year if the custom clients do complete the survey? Are you ranked for custom and overall?
Can you repeat the question?
Sure. What happens if you were not rated for custom for a year? What happens the following year if the custom clients do complete the survey? Are you ranked for custom and overall?
Yeah, you can't be ranked for custom and overall unless you have both custom and open, first of all. So the way the FT calculates their overall ranking is they basically add the two scores together for the open and the custom, and then re-rank all of the players. So the first thing is you need to be eligible for both, and then it's a very good question, and I'm not sure I 100% know the answer, and I would actually defer to the FT to make sure. If a school had open, it continued to have open every year, all 3 years, but had 3 years of open but only 2 years of custom, and the middle year where custom was missing, it's a very good question. I would suspect that you would not be included in the overall ranking in that third year, but I don't 100% know, and I would defer to the FT on that. It's a good question. And you know, the FT is very good about responding to these things, but that's pretty technical, and it's a good one.
Okay, great. Thank you. Is there any sense of the variability of the total number of schools that change from year to year? Do we know if that variability is driven from lack of sufficient responses or by schools opting out, or what's behind the variability?
I'm hearing this right. The number of schools, is the variability of the number of schools driven by whether or not they're opting out or whether or not they're eligibility, not meeting eligibility?
Correct, yeah.
Don't really know. Don't have access to that data. I wish I could answer that question. It's a good question. I would think part of the struggle here is that the FT's eligibility requirement of a $2 million revenues based upon currency exchange rates may create some variability in terms of the number of schools, particularly international and particularly from you know, more developing markets that have higher fluctuations in their currency exchange. I would think that does create some variability. If they had a purchase power PPP adjustment to it, that would potentially help to smooth that, and also potentially help to open the door to some other schools in developing countries. But I don't really know. We don't have enough access to the data behind that. Great question.
Great. Any other questions from our participants regarding today's presentation? Okay. Well, Tom, I think you may have one or two more slides that you wanted to share in terms of additional materials and upcoming webinars.
I do. First slide is just with some additional materials you can get online for this. First, obviously, is the infographic, how the rankings work. We've also got copies of all the ranking magazines since inception. So FT was very gracious to give us permission to publish those, and they should be on UNICON's website shortly, within a week or so, I think. And then we also have, and this is for any rankings geeks like ourselves out there, we also have all of the rankings data for Open, Custom, and MBA in an Excel table going back to 1999. So, if you want to look at it and compare it versus your MBA ranking, look for correlations, look at competitors, look at trends, there's a lot of good data in there. And then to just give you a sneak peek of our next webinar that's coming up on October 15th, and I think it will be really interesting for you. This is really where you're going to get a chance to see what do others think about the ranking. What's everyone saying about the ranking? And how do they use it? What do they think about it? Do they really value it? And we really looked at all 360 degrees here. We looked at the customers, we looked at the business schools, we looked at the experts who know how rankings work. And the kind of key findings were that customers of executive education are very aware of the rankings, so that's important. You guys need to know that they're paying attention, and they use them, but at least to some degree. What you're going to learn is that it's not necessarily a really deep or involved use, but they're using it. You're also going to learn some interesting things about how learning and development professionals use them, and we've heard a lot of different ways in which learning and development professionals use rankings that were maybe a little more involved and a little more complicated than an open enrollment customer does. But I think that's going to be an interesting finding for you. The next thing is that, no surprise here, many business schools are dissatisfied with the rankings. There's a lot of frustration out there. A lot of schools that want to see themselves higher. A lot of schools that would like to see more transparent process and more transparent data. But at the same time, business schools are also the ones that are most responsible for communicating the rankings. As you saw in that slide we had up here at the beginning, business schools definitely see the ranking as a valuable marketing tool. The next point is experts stress that rankings are not quality measures and may fail to capture or even stifle innovation. So, experts want to see that rankings are really reflecting what's going on and really reflect the diversity and complexity of the executive education marketplace. And it is a very fast, changing, evolving, innovative marketplace. And the rankings as they exist today, are rather narrow in how they interpret what's going on in the marketplace. And the experts really speak that home to us. I had a lot of interesting comments about it. All that said, this is the next point. We think, the next 2 points really, we think the rankings can be useful, and we think that this is a unique opportunity to improve them and make them more relevant and make them reflect the diversity and innovation that's going on in the executive education industry. And we hope that this report is really a kind of clarion call for collaboration between the FT, the schools, and their customers to help evolve the ranking and turn it into something new. We have some thoughts on how that could look, and at the end of the next webinar, you'll get to see what those are.
Great. And Tom, I've actually received quite a few questions just as we've covered these last few slides, so if you don't mind, I'd like to just share them with you from our audience. If one school submits 20 clients and another school submits 5 clients, is the average determined from all 20 clients, or are 5 randomly picked?
repeat it, please? If one
Sure.
school, just for
One,
custom kids, I assume?
I would assume so, yes. If one school submits 20 clients and another school submits 5 clients, is the average determined from all 20 clients, or are 5 randomly picked?
No, as I understand, FT will use all of the clients' responses in their survey. So if 20 respond, they'll use 20 responses in it. And if
Okay.
only 5 respond, they'll use all 5 of those responses. And my understanding is that they do not pick which responses to use.
Okay. And are there any instances where schools can include a client more than once if they are running multiple programs, sometimes in different areas?
They have to pick the program. So it's can they use? Let me make sure I understand the question. Can they use multiple programs with the same client? If I understood that correctly? Yes.
That would be my interpretation as well. Yes.
And the answer is one client. So it's not multiple programs with the same client. No, they can't respond twice.
Okay. And regarding the $2 million revenue requirement, if a school participates in both custom and open, is the revenue required for both or either?
It's for either. So you need to have a minimum of, to participate in open, you need a minimum of 2 million, and then to participate in open revenues, and then in custom you need 2 million of revenue as well. So if you were to participate in both, you need a total of 4 million in revenue and 2 million in each.
Okay, great. We have another question. We have seen very significant volatility in the results for several years with virtually identical inputs from us. Do you have any sense for why the wild swings? It seems to invalidate the reliability of the rankings. Any thoughts?
Okay, great question. So I think this is kind of at the heart of the transparency issue here, and it comes down to, you know, is it measuring something that really reflects quality and really reflects what your school is doing? And you know, at the end of the day, they're just measuring 2 programs in your open. So I don't know if you're seeing variability in your open programs or your custom programs, whoever asked that question. Or it could be very few number of clients in your custom programs. And so, you know, you're not seeing a really robust sample size here. The other thing is you're not seeing transparency of data. So the differences between individual schools might be very small, but yet we're seeing very big differences in terms of the rankings, right? Someone has to be number 1, someone has to be number 20. And, you know, at the end of the day, if you lose out because of half a point or half a z-score, you know, that's pretty frustrating. And if you see a big swing in that, that's even more frustrating. If the difference between number 1 and number 20 is, you know, 20 points, it's probably not a very big difference here. So I think the frustration around that is totally understandable and merited, and there's not enough transparency here to really address that. There's not enough robust sampling here of what's going on with schools to catch that. And there's also, the last comment I want to make here is there's also kind of a question about what types of programs are being measured. You know, some schools are, particularly in custom, they're offering very different types of programs. And so if in one year you're offering one type of program, and the next year you're offering another type of program, the types of responses you get, or the repeatability of that response, is going to be different. And the FT is not giving enough transparency here for you to be able to predict that or control that or understand why it might change. So I hear your frustration on that. That's a big issue. Big issue.
We have another question going back to the revenue requirements. Does the FT have any method to smooth the results for schools which make 10 million versus 2 million?
Great question. We have explored and discussed as a team the idea of perhaps creating different rankings based upon size of school or regionality of school. And this would certainly help do something like that. So you could have schools with revenues over 10 million or 20 million. Here's how they rank. Schools with revenues between 5 and 10 million. Here's how they rank. But at the moment, the FT does not do that and has no method to do it.
Great. And we have a request. I know the material will be available on the website, but one of the participants has asked if you could please show slide 29 again, reference.
Okay. Yeah.
Great. Another question from the audience. From your analysis, what are the levers regarding the FT's criteria that would provide the greatest or best return?
That's a good question. That's a good question. I'd like to suggest that for that, you make sure you tune in to the next webinar, because we talk a lot about how business schools are working on the rankings, what they're doing, what best practices are, in terms of managing customers, collecting data on customers. I think that will be helpful for whoever's asking that question. But what I would say is just a high level. I think what we've seen with the successful model is having someone dedicated to the rankings in your organization, someone who's completely focused on making sure that you do well with those rankings. Making sure that you align your internal surveys to the surveys that the FT is using, right? So that you can somehow predict what's going to go on. Picking your programs well. Don't just pick any programs. Pick programs that you know are going to do well. That seems kind of obvious, but I'll say it. And then not being afraid to interact with your clients, be they open or custom, and say, hey, we're going to be ranked on this. We would appreciate you giving an honest appraisal and helping us in this. And some schools do that. Others, I think, are a little nervous about doing that, and I don't think there's any reason you have to be nervous. Everyone knows this ranking's going on. It's the rankings game. It's part of this environment. Go for it. So those are kind of the 4 highlights, I'd say, for how to get the most return out of it. I don't think there's any one question or any one thing in the criteria itself that you need to do well. There's so many criteria. You actually really need to think about each one and think about how you can do well on those. But ultimately, I think that success in the ranking is going to come down to more of those 4 things that I just mentioned.
Great, and this is somewhat related, a question on custom weightings. Can you please review how the issues of client size, seniority of sponsor, type of program are weighted? You indicate that the questions are 80% and key metrics are 20%. So how do these additional questions get included in the weighting?
Yeah, good question. So again, the additional weightings they have here, there's 4 for custom. There's 4. It's more if you get a greater weighting if it's strategic versus functional, greater weighting if it's the CEO sponsoring the course versus a VP, greater weighting if it's a larger organization versus small, and greater weighting if that organization has worked with more schools to create customized programs in the last 3 years. All those weightings get applied to the survey questions from the custom clients. And just jump to my next slide here. the way that's done is after they convert all the answers from the survey into z-scores, they apply these weightings to the z-scores. What that exactly looks like, how that's done as a calculation, you know, that's above my pay grade as a statistician. But that is basically the mechanics of it. They apply the weightings to the z-scores of the questions. And I assume that weighting, those 4 different weightings, would get applied to all of the questions that are asked in the custom survey, right? Not just one question, but all of the questions.
Great. Do you have any sense of other schools' views of dropping out of the FT rankings? It appears that most clients seem to rely on overall school rankings rather than the FT rankings specific to the FT Exec Ed.
No, I don't have a sense of schools dropping out. And you know, I definitely have a sense of dissatisfaction, but you know, it's also something that schools are using quite a bit in their marketing. So I think there's a lot of schools out there who value it, or even if dissatisfied, at least if they have a good ranking, are probably using it. And then with regard to customers, you know, there's a lot of rankings out there, and it's understandable that customers sometimes get confused. Is it the MBA, the online MBA, the MBA, the, you know, the executive ed ranking? Which ranking am I looking at? And, you know, obviously the MBA ranking is the big one and probably the most important one for any school. But you know, I think there's a lot of customers who pay attention to this exec ed ranking, particularly learning and development professionals, and they know it inside and out, and use it as a general guide, general quality guide to some degree. Some of them even said to us, you know, I'm embarrassed to say it, but I do pay attention. The school drops a lot. That's a flag, red flag, right? So people are paying attention to it out there and using it. You know, I don't think it's necessarily very deep. They're not necessarily seeing it as the overall quality measure, but they're definitely using it. So.
Great. And in conducting your research, did you get any sense of what schools are doing to try and increase their response rate to the surveys? We get somebody commenting that they submit a lot of clients, but few respond. That seems to be one of the biggest challenges.
That's interesting. Well, I don't know if I have a answer to that question of like what a lot of schools are doing, but I can tell you what a few schools are doing. But obviously having a good customer relationship database is a start. Let's assume you have that. But I think there's also kind of an active and a passive way to approach this. The passive way is just to give the FT the emails and assume, you know, that everything's going to go fine. The active way is to actually tell your clients that you're going to be surveyed, that you'd like them to participate in this survey, and, you know, and maybe even ask them for a good ranking. And, you know, with custom clients, that's probably done, you know, we've heard of people going out to lunch and just, you know, kind of mentioning it. With open clients, that might be done after the class when you're handing out, you know, the post-class surveys, or in other respects, you could send out awareness emails. I'm not going to advocate any particular approach, but I think that schools can be active in telling their clients that they're going to be surveyed and asking them to participate. And I don't think there's any reason schools need to hold back on that. And so if they're being active and struggling to get schools to participate, clients to participate in the survey, you know, I would look hard at how you're soliciting their input. But my guess is that if you are being active, you're probably getting them to participate. It's probably okay.
Great. Well, I'd like to thank you again, Tom, for your time today and taking us through this presentation. Again, you've shared a lot of information, and I think it's been very informative. And based on the questions from the audience, I think it's been well received, and I think we're hopefully all leaving today's webinar with a better understanding of how the FT rankings work. With that being said, I would like to encourage participants to join us for the next series of sessions of webinars. We do realize that the UNICON audience is a very global and international audience, so we'll be hosting 2 webinars on October 15th to accommodate different time zones. And details for those webinars and specific timing will be available on the UNICON website. So again, Tom, thank you for your time and assistance with today's webinar and your help with the research project. And thank you to the audience for joining us, and we'll hope to see most of you back here on October 15th for the continuing series of webinars.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And this will be posted and available, a replay available on the UNICON website in the days to come. Thanks again, Tom.